Good evening. I'm Robin Garrell, the president of the City University of New York Graduate Center, and I'm delighted to welcome you to another public conversation. Great biographies do much more than describe the lived experience and trajectory of their subjects. They have the power to illuminate history, to inform the present, and to influence readers who will shape the future. Since 2007, the Leon Levy Center for Biography at the CUNY Graduate Center has focused on the biographers themselves and their work, amplifying the achievements of authors who are already established and attracting and training talented new biographers who will write about their subjects from their own unique perspectives. Tonight's discussion will center on a new book that examines many dimensions of one of the most influential people of our time, a person whose life is too wide-ranging and multifaceted to be captured through just a single lens. It makes sense that George Soros, A Life in Full, is the work of many contributors, each examining Soros from a different perspective. At the Graduate Center, we welcome this approach. Our students and faculty are known for their interdisciplinary scholarship and collaborations. Our classrooms and degree programs, including our master's program in biography and memoir, actively invite participation of diverse voices. Tonight, we're joined by several contributors to the kaleidoscopic portrait of George Soros. To welcome our panelists, I'm pleased to introduce Kai Bird, winner of the Pulitzer Prize for Biography and the executive director of the Leon Levy Center. Kai?
Yes, good evening. Thank you very much, Robin. My name is Kai Bird. I'm the director of the Leon Levy Center for Biography, a wholly unique institution hosted by the Graduate Center of the City University of New York, and founded by Shelby White and the Leon Levy Foundation in the year 2007. Is my video started? Yes, okay. Anyway, I want to thank Shelby for her steadfast support to the Biography Center. It is her vision that makes this program possible. Please note that our next event will take place on Tuesday, March 22nd at 6 p.m. when Professor David Nassau will lead a roundtable discussion on radical biographies. Please mark your calendars and register for this event on the Leon Levy website, and please encourage your friends and relatives to subscribe to our digital mailing list on our website. But tonight we are gathered for yet another roundtable discussion, this one focused on the life and career of George Soros. The discussion will be guided by Peter Osnos, the editor of a newly published volume of biographical essays entitled George Soros, A Life in Full. Osnos will be in conversation with three of the contributors to this collection, Leon Botstein, Eva Hoffman, and Sebastian Mallaby. Peter Osnos is the founder of Public Affairs. Before embarking on book publishing, Osnos had a long journalistic career, starting out at I.F. Stone's Weekly and ending as a senior editor at the Washington Post. He is the author of An Especially Good View, Watching History Happen, a delightful memoir published just last summer. So please look for all of these books at bookshops.org, a site that will lead you to your local independent bookstore. Our panelists will be in conversation for about 45 minutes, and then we will take questions from our virtual audience. Please click on the question box below to type in your questions, and Peter will be sure to get to as many as he can. We will try to end this program after about 1 hour or so. Again, thanks to Shelby White and the Leon Levy Foundation for funding this and all our other events. And now I turn this conversation over to Peter Osnos. Thank you, Peter. Peter, you're still muted. There you go.
No, no.
No, you're still muted. Click on the lower left-hand
mute. How's that?
Yeah, you had it.
There we
Okay,
go.
Good.
Excellent.
You know how fond I am, Kai. We've talked about this a lot. How fond I am about these Zoom
apparatus.
It's a new world, and we have to engage with it virtually.
Well, George certainly would if he had to. In fact, that's one of George's many attributes. He has learned how. Now I want to be sure that, Leon, are you there?
I'm here.
Right. All right, we've assembled. And what's really quite remarkable, and I suppose the upside of this, is that Leon's at Bard, and Eva is in, and Sebastian are both in Europe. So really it reflects the sort of global reach that George Soros represents. I think that what we're going to try to do in the time we have, we all essentially know what George has done, and the book jacket lists the kind of basic categories of his life: survivor, billionaire, speculator, philanthropist, philosopher, political activist, nemesis of the far right, and global citizen. And it was our judgment that rather than try to have one person embrace so much, we would go to people who have really deep knowledge of, understanding of the various aspects of George's life. And of the people we asked to contribute and have done, in my humble judgment as the editor, a marvelous job. We have three this evening. Eva Hoffman is the author of the classic Lost in Translation, which, to caption, basically describes what it is like to be a person who loses one's homeland and starts over elsewhere. And of course, that is exactly what happened with George. Sebastian, who is the author of recently published The Power Law, about the history of VCs, and is in fact a leading writer on matters of finance and so on. And Leon Botstein, who is the president of Bard, leading orchestra conductor, and a man who, among many, many other things, knows George really, really well. The book is made up of those essays. And what I'd like to do tonight, very briefly, is ask each of the three of you, Eva, Sebastian, and Leon, a question which will help the viewers understand exactly what it is you've done in your book. So Eva, George says, I'm going to call him Soros. I keep trying to remember that his name is Soros. I know him, you can call him George, but that's not appropriate when you're doing something like this. So Soros always says that the most important year of his life was 1944. He was 14. The Nazis were in Hungary, where George and his family, where Soros and his family lived. What he says is that 1944 gave him a capacity for handling risk, danger, that has served him really well in so many other ways. So Eva, first of all, welcome, and can you express to us in a tight way what it was about 1944 that made George the person he became?
Right, I will try. Well, I mean, you know, the great fact to know is that he was 14 in 1944, and this was the year when the Holocaust really arrived. The Nazis arrived in Hungary, and the Holocaust arrived in Hungary. George and his older Soros and his older brother were in hiding with his father. And, you know, George had always said that he was, you know, protected from danger by his father. He trusted his father implicitly and completely. He adored his father. So in a way, he felt protected from danger. But, you know, he also said, and we were on the side of the angels. And this was, you know, quite important. They were on the right side morally. He also learned how to he learned that he could cope with danger. And, he was in some very risky situations in which he behaved with, great sort of coolness of mind and, and great really bravery. And he saw both the Holocaust, the arrival of the Nazis, and towards the end, the arrival of the Russians, who perpetrated their share of atrocities, although, they were the supposed liberators. They were the liberators from the Nazis. So it was, it was a kind of adventure for a 14-year-old young man. It was an adventure. And it was a time during which he saw his father handle various kinds of decisions, various kinds of risks, with sort of, informed trust in his judgment. Tivadar trusted his judgment implicitly, and he actually rarely made mistakes. But it was a judgment, informed by a lot of experience, a lot of historical experience, a lot of human experience. So, in a sense, George learned this as well. He learned how to handle risks. He actually also learned something about financial speculation or finances in any case, during the period of the Russian occupation when they were out of hiding. And when he was recruited by somebody to exchange the Hungarian currency for a better currency, for the dollar probably. And he saw that there were two different places in which the exchange rates were different. And this was, very, very informative. But, in a sense, he learned how to trust his instincts, how to trust his judgment, how to make instinctive and quick decisions. Which always were also, very ethically informed. And I think, we can see the influence of this in his later career, for example, in the way that he handled the Open Society Foundations and the way that he, entrusted the running of the Open Society Foundations to the people in the various countries where they were cited, but he trusted his judgment in assigning it to the particular people. And he trusted them to know how to take risks. And as far as I can tell, Sebastian, from USA, he also took enormous risks in his financial career. And
well, that is exactly where we're going to go right now, Eva.
Okay.
Sebastian, Soros calls himself a speculator, which in most people's judgment is not an encomium. He's also, I think, the originator of the hedge funds. And certainly that is the thrust of your essay. And what is a hedge fund? It requires a capacity for handling risks, danger, and analysis of a certain kind. What is it about Soros, the speculator, that enabled him to become Soros, the hedge fund pioneer, and, as we know, many, 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 many times over, a billionaire?
I think he had three qualities, Peter, which set him up to be a wonderfully successful speculator. The first quality was that he had a global outlook, coming from the fact that he'd grown up in Central Europe, he spoke French, he spoke German, he'd gone via London to the United States. So by the time he began to trade, most people in that time, in a world of capital controls, traded their own countries. They didn't trade across borders. he from the beginning had a different view, and that made him distinctive. The second thing he had was a view that markets are not actually efficient. His coming of age as a speculator coincided with the ascendancy of the efficient market hypothesis. The 50s, 60s, and 70s were when that view of financial markets, that basically they incorporate all the information that there is out there already. So to beat them, you probably have to be lucky. That sort of high watermark of that view of finance in academia was exactly when Soros, by his practice, was proving the efficient market hypothesis to be wrong. So he came at the whole thing with the view that far from equilibrium, prices were actually to be expected. And again, that marked him off from others. And I think the third thing that Soros had, and this overlaps with what Eva was talking about, and I think hopefully shows the strength of the multi-author biography format, is this attitude towards risk. He did have an amazing appetite for risk. Even other financial practitioners, such as Stan Druckenmiller, who ran the Soros funds for about 11 years, was astonished to watch Soros in action, the amount of money he would put on a position. Other traders might develop a conviction, and it would be the same conviction that Soros had, and they would all bet X, and Soros would come along and bet 3X. He just had that risk appetite. Now, where did it come from? I think what's interesting in sort of the life in full sense is that some of this may have come from his upbringing, the experience of mortal danger in 1944 as a result of the Nazi invasion and so forth, and watching his father handle risk. But I think you can also tell a compelling story that Soros's risk tolerance was founded on the second point I made, that he just didn't think that markets were efficient. He came at markets under the influence of Karl Popper, the LSE-based philosopher who was a big influence on him when he studied and on his later attempts at philosophical writing. Popper's central idea was that human beings cannot apprehend reality accurately and objectively. And to this, Soros added a second insight, which is that not only do traders apprehend the fair value of a stock or a bond imperfectly, the very imperfection of their assessment leads to a further departure from what an objective valuation might be. So for example, if people are unable to perceive the correct value of the stock, they come to a view that it's extremely valuable because it's going to go up because the company is going to do well. That flawed perception, let's say it is flawed for the sake of argument, that flawed perception will actually be self-fulfilling, and then the stock will go up, and then more people will get excited, and so the whole thing goes further and further from equilibrium. And so to him, when he saw something that looked as if it was a very inefficient price, he was willing to bet more than other people because it wasn't a scary anomaly. It was actually a confirmation of his basic view derived from Karl Popper that you should expect completely out of whack prices. So I think it's interesting just to layer on the 1940s Hungary experience with the Karl Popper derived philosophical outlook to come at two ways of explaining that risk appetite.
And the thing is that Soros had less of a strategic vision, excuse me, than an instinctive one, which is really quite remarkable. He wasn't following anybody's game plan other than his own. And Leon, I would say that as George is world famous, and the great majority of the people who've heard of Soros know that he's also the target of really extraordinarily vicious attacks and conspiracy theories about his influence and his role in politics. And he's conceived as some kind of ogre of the left. And Soros himself, I would say, has handled this with extraordinary equanimity. Wasn't crazy about the fact that somebody put a bomb in his mailbox. But this relentlessness of the attacks, even during the Ukraine war, a state senator in Arizona announced that the real culprit in the war was Soros and the Clintons. They were the ones responsible for the war. And so, Leon, knowing Soros as well as you do, and knowing the sort of whole basis of his mindset, what was it that made George this extraordinarily sort of vivid target of people on the far right?
So Soros fits into a very familiar model, and that is of the super wealthy Jew. So the Jew viewed in the European and the American lens is not truly a member of any of the nations that we think about: Polish, Hungarian, German. It's a construct of a cosmopolitan person, and the extremely wealthy Jew, be it the Rothschilds, Bernard Baruch, whomever you want to think of. There is this notion, which was made very popular in 1903 by a forgery called the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, the idea that there are these few Jews or these internationalist cosmopolitans, and they are kind of puppet masters. And in our time, George Soros fits this stereotype to a T. It was not a new theory. It was made popular in the Russian Empire, particularly in 1903, this forgery, and is world distributed now. So he is the one person who fits this model absolutely, both for domestic American politics and internationally. We have to consider who is Soros. Soros is probably the most influential private individual in modern history. Most influential private individual, not because he's rich, but because he devoted so much of his time to political issues, and also, as Sebastian pointed out, also because he was an innovator in the whole world of finance. You know, I think of he's kind of the Marquis de Lafayette of our time, but the Marquis de Lafayette wasn't a French aristocrat. The important thing about Soros is that I think he developed early, as Sebastian and Eva pointed out, a sense of impermanence, that the world is not about permanence, just as about markets are not about equilibrium. There's nothing permanent, and that the world is imperfect. The one encounter, he may think the 44 was a great year. I'm not so convinced his own version of this is accurate. But what he discovered is owning property, an apartment, your jewels, your family portraits, all the things we identify with permanence and stability are in fact not stable and not permanent, and they're not important. He was able to take risks because he's not afraid of being poor. He's able to take risks because he doesn't consider, as most of us do, the things we accumulate to be symbolic of the permanence of the world. Property in the end isn't important. Money really isn't important. And by the same token, he learned that the things we think are conventional values about normalcy, the idea that there's something normal out there, call it friendship, common sense, following the crowd. What he learned is actually to do the opposite, to consider that these things need to be critically looked at, and they reinforce themselves in ways which, in fact, end up often in disaster, such as populism. And finally, the most important thing about it is that the survival gave him an enormous commitment to two values: personal autonomy and independence, and freedom. The idea that the world and individuals deserve both freedom and rights, and that in an unstable and impermanent world, you have to defend those who can't defend themselves, that the inequalities in the world create cruelties and injustices which have to be fought. and that it is the arm of the state, whether it be Nazism or communism, and now let's say Putinism, that these kinds of despotic controls over individual lives have to be fought. He is motivated by those ideals. So the combination of a willingness to confront the impermanence, the imperfection, and the fact that things we treasure are things that we ought to think about being able to let go of, is all this is in the service of trying to create a politics that actually is centered on personal freedom and autonomy.
Excellent. Let me try it just very briefly to summarize the sort of backstory of the book. It was the summer of 2020. George was turning 90. Ordinarily, there would have been a significant celebration of one kind or another. I have been Soros's book publisher for a quarter of a century at Public Affairs. And I was on the phone Zoom with him. And well, what can we do, Mr. Soros, George? Because this is an extraordinary occasion. Why don't you write your memoirs? And of course, he told me he was absolutely not going to do that. So what we proposed instead was finding people who would be able to dig so deeply into the various aspects of Soros's life and career that we would have, in effect, a biography of an extraordinary person in an unusual way. But what we needed in order to be able to do that was that Soros had to give us what essentially was the pledge that we could do this book, that he would cooperate and others would cooperate where we needed it, but they would not interfere. And it is a fact that Mr. Soros, his wife, Tomiko, and none of the other people around him actually read the book until it was done. It was an act of trust because the writers, all of whom are distinguished, wouldn't have been comfortable writing something that was essentially authorized. So while it was in fact the original conception came through a discussion with Soros, it wasn't his book, it was ours. Let me very briefly tell you about some of the other essays. Michael Ignatieff, very distinguished, also writer, philosopher, has been the president of Central European University, which is the Soros-funded university, which is originally in Budapest, but basically driven out by Orban, is now in Vienna. And what Ignatieff has done is show you how George's philosophical thinking enabled him to create this extraordinary higher educational institution, which I need to point out does not carry his name. That among philanthropists is not typical. Gary LaMarche, who until recently was the president of the Democracy Alliance, which is a major alliance of progressive, wealthy progressives who support progressive causes, and has worked with Soros, was the first director of the US programs of the Open Society Foundations, which is George's foundations. And he kind of writes about, he takes the origins of George's engagement in politics up to the point which I think Leon has been talking about, when his engagement with politics turned him into this paragon of right-wing ignominy. Orville Schell, the great China specialist, director of the Asia Society's China program, he was the person who brought Soros into China, where for many years Soros believed that he could influence what was underway in China, which was the combination of a society with ambition and innovation and interest in making money, but also he could create civil society institutions. Darren Walker, president of the Ford Foundation, has written about George's philanthropic. George, you know, after Gates, maybe, Soros is the leading philanthropist in terms of the money he has devoted to his causes. And what makes him different is that classic philanthropists put their names on things and built things, or sponsored science, or sponsored. George Soros sponsors values. All of his foundations were meant to create civil society institutions all over the world devoted to open society values. And that, in Walker's view, is a unique form of philanthropic initiative. And finally, Ivan Krastev is part of that generation that came of age after the Cold War. And I would say, in summary, what he writes about, he's from Eastern Europe, Bulgaria, and what he writes about is the arc in which the early optimism or the hopes that the dissolution of the USSR would create a whole series of model democracies out of the former Soviet republics. What has been the trajectory, which, as we all know now, has not ended well, and certainly in the case of Russia, where Soros had placed great hope and a great deal of money. At one point, as I recall, any scientists in the immediate post-Soviet period who needed it got money from the Soros foundations, from OSF. So I want to go back now to Eva. We're living through what we all acknowledge is a remarkable moment, because this sort of post-Cold War era that began with 1991 and the dissolution of the Soviet Union is decisively over. Putin's invasion of the Ukraine is, by any measure, the first time since the end of the World War II that one country has said, I want the other one. I'm going to take it, whether it wants it or not. One of the things that's very interesting to me, Eva, and you know so much about the Central European mindset, why do you think it is that Putin views Ukraine and these other places, other countries, Poland, Hungary, as belonging to him? What is it that makes this current notion, which so defies the Soros concept of open societies and democracies, what is it that is, can you imagine, drives Putin?
Not sure that, one can have complete insight into the mind of Vladimir Putin. But I would think that his enormous resentment at losing the empire, basically, is partly driving what seems to me to be a completely insane venture, which is, I would think, not going to end well for him in Russia, as well as for the Ukraine. He, I think, is in his imagination hearkening back to the wartime period in which the Ukraine was, part of the Soviet empire, and also in which the Soviets, as opposed to the Nazis, were on the side of the angels, comparatively speaking. So, it is a very tough question to answer. It is amazing that he keeps, referring to Ukraine as an anti-Semitic state. Now, there is a historical partial truth about it. There was a pro-Nazi element among the Ukrainians during World War II. And it was partly there because they hated the Russians more than they hated the Germans, because they had been persecuted by the Russians in, you know, the most awful ways. I mean, the Russians basically caused a great famine of 1932, in which, you know, the Ukrainians were deprived of their crops, and, you know, they starved and they ate their horses and worse. So, you know, they had horrible memories of, you know, of the Russians, of the Soviets. At the same time, I think Putin still thinks of the Ukraine as his vassal state. Did I just say that? You know, he can't get used to the idea that it is an independent nation. And I must say, you know, that I think perhaps all of us are amazed by the, you know, degree of resistance that Ukraine has put up. So, you know, I think all of this is.
Thanks, but let me bring it back to the question of how George Soros became the person he is, because what's striking to me in the way that Soros thinks and writes and so on, and so many people like him in that part of the world, their memories are very indelibly marked by the centuries of Russian domination, of anti-Semitism. When Putin talks about the, quote, pro-Nazis, or the scripto, whatever he calls them, neo-Nazis in the Ukraine, Vladimir Putin at 69 is talking about the Ukraine in 1944. And that's his justification. Sebastian, the nature of this invasion is to completely upend Russia's economy, in which Soros at one time actually did a great deal of investing in trying to make the post-Soviet Russia into a major player on the world financial stage. What do you think is going to be the impact on Russia now of the invasion and the consequences? And what does it say about Soros's efforts to change Russia?
Well, there was a fascinating moment in the late 1990s when Soros's philanthropic efforts included a big effort to help the Russian transition to an open society. And when around 97, remember Russia defaulted in 1998, bringing down the, essentially foreshadowing the fall of Yeltsin and setting things up for the arrival of Putin. But in that year or so before the default, there was a struggle to kind of prop the system up financially, and Soros was engaged in secret loans to the Russian government to help it to stay afloat and meet its debt obligations. And one of the fascinating things about, you know, the multifaceted George Soros is that for a while he kept his philanthropic hat on when he was in Russia or thinking about Russia, and he kept his speculator's hat off. He deliberately didn't want to invest in the place where he was focusing his philanthropy. And by the way, he tangled these things up or separated them at various times in sort of unpredictable ways. When he was trading in East Asia during the Asian financial crisis, you know, in Thailand, he was happy to make a lot of money by going short the currency and predicting its collapse. In Korea, although his staff wanted to do the same thing and they could quite see how it would make a lot of money, Soros himself refused to do it and preferred to visit South Korea as a statesman, a philanthropist, and in fact to give talks about how speculation might be destabilizing, how it might be evil. And so there was always this fascinating sort of, you know, multiple persona side of George Soros, which makes it fitting that we have a multiple author volume here. But going back to Russia, there was a moment in 1997 when he sort of cracked in this discipline that he had not to go into Russia as an investor. And he became part of a consortium which put money into the state-owned company Sviazinvest. And what's amazing about it is that, of course, the premise for investing in a state-owned company in 1997 has to be that the ruble is not going to collapse, the political system is not going to collapse, the financial system is not going to be in the tank. And he did this investment, even though with his other hat on, he was the philanthropist secretly propping up the finances of the Russian government. So he knew perfectly well how frail it was. And when he's tried to explain in his own writings how it was he came to put, his financial trader's war chest into a trade that, as a philanthropist, he knew was likely to go wrong, he has this most, I think, strange and fascinating explanation about how, if he only had been a philanthropist in Russia, he would have been a sort of disembodied intellect, a kind of messiah figure on high. These are not my words, these are his words. And he had to descend from the mountaintop, again, his words, and become flesh and blood by investing like a normal rapacious capitalist is expected to do. And so he almost came down from the mountain, as it were, like a saint to save the sinners. And the result was that he lost that investment in Svyazhinvest, and it went horribly wrong. But as far as I can tell, he is never minded about that. The people who did mind were the people working for his hedge fund, who then had to go and clear up the mess of his ill-conceived investment, and it took them several years to get out from that hole.
And Leon, I'm going to slightly curveball you a bit, because I was going to ask you about what the implications are for post-Cold War world. But I think your relationship with Soros, personal, professional, is extraordinarily deep. You are yourself of a Central European background. You are yourself a very innovative intellectual and an entrepreneur in, for example, what you've done with Bard. Tell me what you think is the way you confront Soros both as a friend and as a professional, or whatever the proper term is. How do you deal with Soros and get things done, given the strength of his character, and, if I may say so, the formidable nature of yours?
So, Peter, if I may, I'm happy to answer. It's just there's a simple answer. I just want to amplify something you said. Soros did in the 90s create a fund of 100 million to support the infrastructure of Russian science. Something that is interesting is George is not the prisoner of history, he rethinks it. So he was a real advocate in the early 90s of a kind of Marshall Plan for Russia to really, as Sebastian suggests, invest in the future of Russia without resentment. And the things that have happened with Putin are the things that Soros has always understood to be problematic. One is nationalism. And what Eva says about Russia is right. This is a make America great again, flip a model in Russia, immensely popular. Make Russia great again, restore its grandeur. And Ukraine is, in their mind, the home of Russia. The whole old Russia is located beginning in Kiev. So the idea that this is their place seems a kind of natural argument, and that Ukrainian nationalism, which has a long history, is something that these national sentiments is paralleled by an extreme right-wing Russian nationalism that has an unhealthy relationship also with religion, with the church and the support that the church provides to Putin. These old devils, which have really created enormous bloodshed in this region, were the ones that Soros has always tried to fight. And I think he saw initially Russia as a place where it could be fought. And as Sebastian suggests, that gamble didn't work out. It looked like it would work out. As far as dealing with Mr. Soros, one of the most incredible things about him is that the way to deal with him is to think independently, to contradict him, to confront him, and to persuade him, not to flatter him. You talk about philanthropists. All of us are subject to flattery, and all of us are subject to being told what we want to hear. The way to deal effectively with Mr. Soros is to foreground the ideals that motivate you and your reasons, and also not be afraid to contradict him, to suggest that what he's saying, he has always liked a good argument, a good debate. And he's one of the few people I've known of success and authority who's willing to change his mind and to admit that he was wrong. How many people have you met who are willing to say, you know, I've been arguing this, now that you might be right, I might be wrong. So it is he's constantly thinking and constantly questioning. And people who get into trouble with him are those who think they can anticipate a sort of patterned reaction on his part, that he'll take a position. What Sebastian said about the notion that as you push a certain point of view, you detach yourself from the reality, and his theory of reflexivity, so forth. So it is the independence of your opinion and your willingness to get into an argument and even lose that argument, and also with the chance that you might win it. But I think we need to realize that in '89, Mr. Soros and a lot of the people involved in the foundations looked at this as a short game. The open society, we assume freedom is something that people want, autonomy is something that people want, diversity is what people want, dissent is what people want. It's not the case. Authoritarianism has a huge popular base. Conformism, people resent people who are different. People resent exceptional people. And there is this resentment, we hear it all the time, of elites. And I think that the power of old myths of nationalism, we see it at work with Putin. Putin, I disagree. I think Putin might actually be successful. He will conquer Ukraine. I mean, I think it will be a long, tragic saga. And the resistance, it'll make the Russian control of Afghanistan look like a puppet theater. It's a huge country, and it's going to be very hard. Ukrainians might actually succeed in stopping him. But the idea of reconquering an empire is wildly popular. Hitler got away with it in the 30s. And Putin might very well get away with it in an unspeakably cruel and violent way.
Leon, I know we're supposed to go to questions.
Yeah, I just want to say the fight that he has engaged in is a much tougher one than even he realized.
Right. I think we would all agree, and we would all wish Putin ill. So let me go to the questions which we have. And the first one is, I'm not at all surprised. The first question is, what is the reason underlying Soros's anti-Israel stance? Do you want to take that, Leon?
Yeah, I don't think he has an anti-Israel stance. I think that's not true. He's not a Zionist, as many Jews are not Zionists. He's not unique. He is not a primary interest of his, but to call him anti-Israel, I think, is a mischaracterization. He's invested in Israel, he's visited Israel. There's nothing particularly, he's not an enthusiast. He's not a Zionist.
It's also a fact, and I don't know why, but I suspected this might be the first question. There's a kind of default often in the assumption that Soros's motives are negative, that he's anti this, he's anti that. I can tell you, having known him pretty well, not as well as Leon, but known him for a long time, he's deeply aware of his Jewish origins. He's deeply aware of what it meant to he and his family and to all those around him to be a Jew. He understands that the Hungarian attacks on him are anti-Semitic, but that doesn't mean that he looks at Israel and says anything it does is something that I have to approve of. There's nothing in Soros's personal background which suggests that he goes along just because he has to. The next question comes, I would say, rather dramatically from Shelby White, without whom we wouldn't be having this conversation. And she says, what does Soros think about the current situation? And she wants me to direct it to you, Leon.
I can't say from any direct conversation with him, but I am quite certain that he has been already in 2014 a huge supporter of Ukraine and a huge supporter of their struggle to resist the Russians. The one thing that I think is included in Mr. Soros's concern is how to help the dissenting Russian community. One of the things we have to guard against is a kind of blanket anti-Russian sentiment. And there are large numbers of Russians who are horrified and are in a police state in which their lives are at risk. So I think that's probably not only the support of Ukraine, but also the support of let's call it the liberal dissenting segment of the Russian intelligentsia and population.
I am quite sure that he has issued statements in the last week or two that could be easily found online. What Leon says is absolutely right. His interest in Ukraine, particularly after the Yellow Revolutions, Maidan and so forth, was profound. He became a really major supporter of the democratic reforms in Ukraine.
And that they have Open Society has personnel there as well, yeah.
Right. And then the next is a very interesting question. It's from Mary Hyatt. Soros has he succeeded in getting progressive district attorneys elected in the US? And if yes, have they improved the way defendants are treated? Who wants to take that? And maybe it should be, well, I can take that, I think. I think one of the misunderstandings of Soros's political engagement is that it's all about presidential politics and Congress and so on. And in fact, increasingly and with some success, the Soros political engagement is at lower levels. It's at the level of state and local government because of the belief that he has that what happens locally is very, very important, and particularly the areas that are of interest to him, like criminal justice and the courts. So he's been extremely active in supporting.
If I may, I don't mean to interrupt, but there's a very important question the public needs to know. There's the Open Society Foundation, which does not engage in direct politics. That's
exactly right.
And then there's Mr. Soros as a private philanthropist, as a private political contributor. Those are two separate pockets, if you will. And I think what you say is absolutely right. In the foundation, there's been a huge interest in the protection of people of poverty or people who are discriminated against and their access to justice. That's been a real focus: criminal justice, defendants, courts, and the idea of a true rule of law. And the foundation does that in a non-political way. He himself, as you point out, has in fact supported candidates locally who have those values of equal justice.
That's a really important distinction, Leon. Thank you, because the truth is there's a tendency to lump everything Soros does into sort of one thing, which is not in fact the case. Open Society Foundations is a vast array of interests and supports a vast array of issues among, end of life and legalization of certain kinds of, marijuana and so on. Things that would add to a progressive agenda around the country that have nothing to do, as I said, open society principles, social justice, civil rights, human rights. And that's very different from the directly political ways in which he has been active through PACs and so on. And here's, I think, the last question, which essentially goes back to the first. I've been doing this with a cold, and I'm getting close to the end, and so are we. It says, if I'm correct, Mr. Herbert Weller says, Soros has placed few resources into the Jewish world. Why? Leon?
Well, I think the reason is simple. It's not his primary interest, and he's not an active member of the Jewish community. Second of all, there is no shortage of philanthropists who are primarily interested in the Jewish community, and there is no reason that he should. He has invested philanthropically in places that other philanthropists wouldn't go. And we should be thankful for that. Why should everybody run in the same direction? I don't think he has any obligation to be active in Jewish philanthropy. He has done a world of good without focusing on that. This is not a person who thinks in, if I may say so, tribal or essentialist views of identity. He is a citizen of the world in the best sense of the word.
I want to close by really asking Eva and Sebastian one final question. Having listened to this, both of you have written in depth and with real insight on aspects of the Soros character and his life and career. What do you think, Eva, yourself coming from Central Europe, yourself having written so deeply about those issues of what it means to be Central European, what it means to have been shaped by the Holocaust, what do you think the Soros legacy will be? He's 91, 10th decade.
Yes. I think, his works are there, to be continued in the next generation. I think he will be seen as an altruistic philanthropist who is very thoughtful. How can one summarize it? I mean, I think in a sense we have talked about all the things that he has done, and I think they will be remembered. And I think he in Central Europe he will be remembered as the person who has contributed greatly to its democratization. I mean, the process of democratization has really been successful. The wheel of history, the pendulum swings, and so there is no final point. But the democratization there has been extremely successful, and so he will be. I think he will be remembered as, doing good for its own sake.
And to make a point there, Eva, when Henry Ford created the Ford Foundation, no one would have guessed that 100 years later, the Ford Foundation would represent so many things that Henry Ford was opposed to. And I think one of the amazing facts of the Soros legacy is going to be, in the philanthropic and philosophical ways, do his ideas transcend the decades in the way that they were meant to, or will they somehow be redesigned? And Sebastian, I think we really are getting to the close here. What about what he's done to finance? What about what he's done into the way, you've just done this wonderful book on venture capital. And I think everybody on this call will know what venture capital is. It was the source of a great deal of money into all the great tech places and so on. What do you think Soros has done to the way we imagine finance and the way we imagine wealth?
I find myself citing his example when people in finance ask me the question, will everything be taken over by artificial intelligence? Because there's some kinds of financial trading where you mine past patterns and look for the way that those could be exploited for profit, and you create algorithms which computers can be better at than people. But the type of financial speculation that George Soros mastered is the kind where I don't think artificial intelligence will ever do that, because it's not about playing the game. It's about looking for changes in the rules of the game. That is, how George himself would put it. He would say, I'm not playing the game. I'm looking for changes in the rules of the game. And that is a sort of almost Renaissance man kind of challenge. You have to bring in insights from politics, insights from economics. You have to understand central banks. You have to understand company accounts. You might have to understand political shifts. You might have to understand, cultural factors. It's just a multifaceted thing which sort of defies algorithmic precision. And George Soros, without creating a big company, without creating an algorithm, generated extraordinary speculative profits over a period of 30 years or so. And it stands as a monument to the enduring influence of human intelligence in comprehending public affairs.
I think that would be the summing up of this entire effort as we discussed it, which is the one thing you can say about George Soros, that he is a man, a life in full, a man in full, and very much a human in full, with all the aspects of humanity that are implied. And that is why I think his various accomplishments are remarkable, because, humans have their limits, and he's sort of been busting the limits in so many different ways. I think, I can't really 100% tell, but I think we're out of time. Kai, is that the case? If not, there are 15 more questions. Somebody want to help me out here?
We've hit the 7:05 mark.
Yes, I think you're out of time, Peter.
Thank you, Kai. So what I should really be doing then is saying thank you to everybody. And to remind you that there's a book involved here, and it's called George Soros, A Life in Full. It was published by Harvard Business Review Press in cooperation or collaboration with Platform Books, which happens to be the publishing company that I've created since Public Affairs. And so it's, and I'm going to say there's the show must go on concept to this. I'm going to go back, put my head in and take some hot soup. Anyway, thank you all for coming. And it was a very, 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 very interesting hour as far as I'm concerned. Thanks. Bye-bye.